Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Seth Rosen. I am the Director of Strategic Growth at the National LGBTQ Bar Association and Foundation. And today, the topic of our webinar is living with and moving through community trauma. Now, I want to start by acknowledging that we're going to be talking about some rather difficult issues, very heavy issues today, including mental health, violence against LGBTQ plus people, and also episodes of political and domestic terrorism. And these can all be rather frightening, and they can be rather heavy. So I want to really say that if you're watching this, you are part of a community that cares for you, values you, and sees you. And that includes the National LGBTQ Bar. And if you are having any questions or issues with your mental health, I really encourage you to reach out to a professional. There are some national organizations that could be helpful: Lifeline, Trans Lifeline, the Trevor Project, but there are resources. And I just want to emphasize again, you are not alone, and we see you and we value you. So we have a truly incredible panel today. When I saw who was on it, I was just really blown away. And I want to say thank you to the BAR's program team, Judy O'Kelly and Patrick O'Brien, who are just amazing and put together today's program. And I encourage you to go on the LGBTQ bar.org to see our other programming as well. But first, thank you to our speakers who have volunteered their time today. This is a group of really top-notch legal practitioners, thought leaders in the legal field, and people with deep expertise in equity, diversity, and inclusion for all people, but especially LGBTQ plus people. And I'm just so thrilled and grateful you're here. So I'm just going to introduce everyone first. First, we have Marla Butler. Marla is one of the smartest people I know, and a person who I'd want to be my own attorney, quite frankly, if I ever needed it. Marla is a partner at Thompson Hine and focuses on really high stakes commercial litigation. She's also the partner in charge of the Atlanta office and is the firm-wide chair of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And we're very lucky to say is also a member of the BAR's board of directors. Next is a person who really does not need any introduction, Shannon Minter. If you have been following any of the major civil rights advances for LGBTQ plus people over the last few decades, you are quite familiar with Shannon. But Shannon is the legal director of NCLR and was a key attorney in bringing marriage equality to the United States. So thank you, Shannon. Next, we have somebody who's in the middle of our lineup, and I think that's really the perfect place today, is Samantha Tenner. And Samantha sits at the crossroads of mental health and the law, somebody who is both a mental health professional and a therapist, but is also an attorney as well, and is going to provide us with a really unique view on both the mental health and legal side and how they come together. So Samantha, I'm really thrilled you're here. Next, we have Professor Tobias Barrington-Wolff. If you have been listening to any insightful commentary about recent legal happenings on the federal level, you have definitely heard Tobias's really inspiring and important analysis on a variety of different platforms. But Tobias is the Jefferson B. Fordham Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, but is also the Deputy Dean for Equality and Inclusion. So we're thrilled to have you here, Professor. Thank you. Next, we have incredible Sandra Yamate. Sandra just brings such a deep wealth of experience of diversity and inclusion. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Field, and also just an incredibly smart and insightful person who provides amazing commentary on DEI all the time. So Sandra, we're so glad you're here. I think I've introduced everyone, so thank you. Today is really going to be a conversation. I'm going to start us off and then ask our panelists some questions. But during the course of today, please use the Q&A function to include any questions you have. We'll ask our panelists those questions. And this is a time for us really to come together as a community and think about how we can work together to move through some really challenging and difficult events, both ones that are occurring now and ones that may happen in the future. So let's just kind of set the stage of where we are. It really feels like we have been living in a time of heightened trauma for LGBTQ plus people for many, many years now. While we know how much work there still was to do, particularly for trans and non-binary people, the social and political spheres had felt like we were moving into an era of things looking up for queer people. And then the 26 election came and the Trump regime came into power, and things changed so quickly and so, quite frankly, terribly. We saw people rolling or attempting to roll back hard-won rights and a massive upspring in anti-LGBTQ plus legislation at the state level. And I also want to acknowledge here, it's not just LGBTQ plus rights and hate that we've been seeing on the upswing. Let's really acknowledge all of our identities here for both gender, religion, race. All of these have come together, increased attacks on people on a variety of identities. And for many queer people who sit at the intersection of different identities, this is especially difficult, but everyone has faced an increase of hate, particularly since 2016. Now we've had a time when the attacks are not coming from the executive branch, but are still coming from the state and other lawmakers at the federal level. And it still does feel like a very extended time of trauma, which has been exacerbated by COVID, which is isolating for many of us, and now direct violence that happened in Colorado Springs last month. So we're really hoping today to be able to have a conversation about how members of the LGBTQ plus legal community are feeling right now in the wake of this, and to start talking about how we both live in this time and also how we can help each other to move through the trauma and into a space that is healthy for all of us. So let's start, my question to the panel, let's really start by talking about the recent events that precipitated this conversation. It's been a rough couple of months and we've had a little bit of distance from that horrible day, but if you can call back to it, what was your first reaction to the violence that unfolded at Club Q in Colorado Springs on November 19th to 20th? And it was also on the eve and on Transgender Remembrance Day. So it was especially just chilling and just frightening. So I'd love if our panel can begin with that. Sandra, can I ask you to start with that?
Happy to. First, I think that we should maybe name the victims from that horrible day, because otherwise it's too easy to simply write it off as an event without remembering human lives were lost, people were affected. And so I think we need to make sure that we remember the names of Daniel Aston and Derek Rump and Kelly Loving, Ashley Paugh and Raymond Vance, because otherwise I think we are in danger of losing some of the humanity around this discussion. For me, it was just a quiet weekend at home. My husband had to work, and so I was enjoying the company of my two dogs. But Sunday morning, suddenly I'm bombarded with calls and texts from friends expressing horror and sadness as the Sunday morning news programs came on. And it was just this awful feeling of, oh my gosh, not again. That for all the talk that we as a society, as a country, have addressed these issues, it just feels like this perpetual cycle where we will be upset and we'll talk about it and nothing truly changes. So there was just a lot of heartache and sadness, devastation, and just a lot of frustration and anger that we were having to grapple with this yet again.
Sandra, thank you. And I'm so glad that you named the victims. I really appreciate that. Shannon, so you have been at the forefront of advancing LGBTQ plus legal rights and civil rights. How are you feeling when you heard the news of what happened?
It was just awful. It was just absolutely horrifying. One of the first things I thought is I had remembered something that Nadine Smith, who's the director of Equality Florida, had said to me some time ago when we first started to see the resurgence of the rhetoric around LGBTQ people being groomers and predators of children. Nadine had just made the very matter of fact, direct point in a conversation, that is in effect an invitation to violence. You know, that if you say someone is a danger to children, that is like one of the circumstances in our society where people feel entitled to hurt them, you know, to be violent. And I'm not suggesting, I know it's always more complicated and you can't draw a direct line of causality or anything like that. But boy, it was sure living in a climate that appears to be encouraging, condoning both, you know, implicitly and explicitly violence against our community, against other communities too. So yeah, it's horrifying. And then after a little bit, when I saw the coverage, one of the things that made me so sad, just so horribly sad, is how how transgender people clearly in that community, in that bar, had been so embraced and loved and were so visible and central. And the bartender was a transgender guy, and about how wonderful that is. Like, because that, you know, that's not something that has always been true. And it's a mark of how much our community has grown and embraced transgender people, and then to have people get targeted and shot is just extra sad and upsetting.
Shannon, thank you. And I'm really glad that you also talked about the grooming and the language there, and something that we're seeing, you know, even I'm in New York City, and we had a recent enormous protest at, not enormous, but quite large protest for a drag queen story hour that was focused on calling LGBTQ plus people pedophiles and groomers, and even resulted in people then going to the homes of people on the city council here in New York. So it's that language is so inciting. So thank you. I really appreciate that. Marla, can you talk a little bit about your experience? And then also, I'm interested of the experience of your colleagues in Big Law and at the firm, how that was reflected on as well.
Sure. And so, not to kind of repeat what Sandra and Shannon said, but, you know, my reaction was very similar. It was, you know, not again, and then it was also not that surprising given the climate that we're in. And the not very surprising piece also relates to the fact that it was another incidence of gun violence that we have been seeing, you know, so much of in recent years. In terms of how colleagues responded, you know, it's interesting. I mean, I think depends on what colleagues you're talking about. I think there's a certain segment of people in law firms and in just, you know, professional organizations that aren't focused on LGBTQ issues, where there's silence and there's a kind of a lack of appreciation of the impact of events like these on our community. And that's an unfortunate thing. There's also a segment of people who experienced it like I did. And that's you know, not surprised, but, you know, but very frustrated and disappointed and hurt by it. And then I think there are people even within the LGBTQ community, but certainly, you know, in kind of all types of organizations who are desensitized to these issues a bit because of how, I think it's a combination of how often they have been happening, but also, and, you know, I don't know, maybe Samantha will have something on this, but, you know, but some kind of self-protection of, you know, just our psyche and just the need to not engage too deeply because we need to function in our lives. And so I observed kind of all three of those, you know, silence and a lack of awareness, you know, people kind of fully engaging and being not surprised, but still being disappointed. And those who were aware of it, but chose not to engage out of a sort of self-preservation.
You know, I think that's such an important point of how do we mourn and continue and walk and continue to our work at the same time. And I want to talk about that more in just a minute, but I really appreciate that. And I think it's so interesting to me hearing you talk about colleagues who, of course, were affected and others that are not yet engaged in some ways with LGBTQ plus issues. And how do we as a community make sure that our allies how do we have more allies and help them become engaged? Thank you. Tobias, you also sit in a really interesting place because you obviously have your own experience, but then you are somebody who is helping to shape the next generation of attorneys and the future of the legal sector. So I'd love if you could share your own experience about what happened and your thoughts around what happened that day, but also if you feel comfortable sharing what you saw from students and your colleagues in academia about how they were reacting as well.
Sure. Thank you. And I think the first thing that I want to say builds a little bit on Marla's observations, that I think there's a particular dynamic that I saw and experienced following the murders in Colorado, and that relates to the very different perceptions of different audiences about where queer and trans equality are right now in the United States. I think that for a lot of people, including some people within the community, I think probably disproportionately, white gay men, but not exclusively so. There is this sense that there's been all this progress, and therefore, the large battles have been won, and therefore the advocacy and grassroots efforts at forming community and advancing visibility that try to draw attention to continued sources of threat and menace and struggle are treated with a kind of dismissive response. They are treated as histrionic. They are treated as self-indulgent, right? Attempting to draw focus to oneself for no good reason. They're treated as niche. I think that, non-binary people encounter this constantly, right? As though they're being, they're being sort of self-indulgent in asking that their truth about gender be taken seriously. The targeting of drag shows was treated as this kind of flippant, with this flippant response, as this kind of frivolous issue. And when the atrocities happened in Colorado Springs, in addition to the horror and trauma of it, there was this quality of this being an occasion to attempt to sort of convince people, no, this is a real issue, right? And that there was a confirmatory quality to it. And that was awful, right? Like, you don't want to feel in a moment of hideous personal and human tragedy like that you're somehow vindicated in making a point. That's not the psychic and spiritual space that you want to be in. And yet, I think for a lot of us, there was an element of that because we had been confronting this kind of gaslighting skepticism about the realities of continued trauma and continued violence in our community. And so that, if that resonates for anybody in our audience, you're not alone in having had that experience of trying to figure out, how do I navigate, the human response to this awful act of violence, but also this sense of, I need to use this occasion to make a point that this has been a real thing that we have been struggling against, and not just a self-indulgent moment of frivolity in our community. And relatedly, in particular, you ask about the experience of my students. I think that everybody, particularly young people, have been so pressed beyond their limits in so many different ways for the last many years, right? Through the combination of the depredations of the last administration and the climate that it continues to foster, and the alienation and isolation of the pandemic and of the quarantine phase of the pandemic, and of navigating risk and managing risk in ways that are very personal and physical and very difficult, and the disruption to people's educations. I think that students at every level are making really tough triage choices about what they have the bandwidth to deal with. And I saw a lot of my students, in response to the murders in Colorado Springs, just making some kind of, some brutal decisions about, here's how much of this I have the space and the bandwidth to deal with right now, and here's how much of it I don't. And there wasn't a lot of call within my educational community for moments of acknowledgement and moments of remembrance and creating space for conversation, because I think a lot of my students just felt like they needed to get through the end of the semester and get their work done and figure out on their own terms when they were going to deal with this and in what way they were going to deal with it. The one thing that I'll say as a last, at least initial observation about my students is something which I think and hope will be valuable for practicing lawyers to hear too, which is that one of the things I emphasize with my students is you don't have to stop being a full human being in order to be a formidable professional, right? I think that for a lot of law students, they arrive in law school and in one way or another, they have this sense of what kind of person you're supposed to be an impressive lawyer. And it's a highly gendered understanding in a lot of ways. It is highly class and race inflected understanding in a lot of ways. And I think it leads a lot of students to believe that having needs in circumstances of difficulty and circumstances of trauma makes them somehow is an indication that they're not measuring up as professionals. And one of the things that I emphasize with my students is that, in fact, it makes you a responsible professional to deal in a serious way with your needs as a human being, that you are not serving your colleagues well, you're not serving your clients well, you're not serving an institution well if you subject yourself to the harm associated with not addressing your needs, that you don't stop being a full human being when you become a professional. And so I think for practicing lawyers as well, it's important to hear that sometimes, that if you experience trauma that requires you to take space and to make adjustments in response to that trauma, you're not demonstrating yourself to be a less than fully formidable professional. You're demonstrating yourself to be a responsible professional. And there's been more discussion about that proposition in the medical field in recent years, and the specific problem of substance abuse, for example, in the medical profession. There's been nowhere near enough discussion of it in the legal profession, and the very serious problem of substance abuse, for example, in the legal profession as well. And so when an event like Club Q happens, I think it's important for lawyers and law students to hear that they're allowed to have a reaction and have that be a fully integrated part of their identity as professionals. It's not this other thing that they have to do and then they go back to being a professional. And I had some conversations along those lines with some of my students.
Mm-hmm. Tobias, that's so powerful, and the advice is so welcomed of being a full, that to be the best attorney or advocate you can be is really to be a full person and to take care of yourself and acknowledge your own needs. And I think that's such great advice, because in the legal profession specifically, many people are taught to push down their own personal needs, especially their grief or trauma that they're having, in order to do the job, to have the billable hour, to move forward. And we're not doing a service to ourselves, to our future, or to our clients when we do that. And I think that's just incredible advice. Thank you. Samantha, I wanted to save you for last on this question, but also to kind of ask you how you were feeling or what your thoughts were when you heard what happened with Club Q, but also if you could then lead us a little bit into how you are dealing with this trauma as both a mental health professional and an attorney. Right? I think you have some really amazing insights that you can share with us about what you're doing. And also, am I right that you were in Denver? So extremely close to where the murders took place, which is, wherever you are, it's very real and traumatizing, but that physical proximity, that geographical proximity is very difficult as well. So if you could tell us a little bit about what was happening for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I was kind of going to say just that. I think this is very hard on any LGBTQ plus community in any state. I'll say that not only being an advocate and member of the community, but living in Denver, having queer friends from Colorado Springs, it just felt so real. I always have empathy for the horrific events that like this that happens in other places, but I will say there is something so profoundly and immediately disruptive in your nervous system when it feels so close. And you see the effects or aftermath of this event not just happen on TV or in the media, but when you go talk with your friends from Colorado Springs, when you go to a queer bar in Denver after the event, which I did do. So yeah, first reaction was, this is horrible. I'm angry, I'm scared, I'm sad. And oh, wow, this is in my backyard. And how can I hold space for not only myself in this moment, but now for clients and for friends. So that was kind of immediate reaction. And in terms of how I handle it, and I will touch on this in a little bit, and Marla did bring it up in terms of the avoidance, right? I will talk about how avoidance is totally a superpower. We're protecting ourselves, right? And in order for me to show up for my clients, in order for me to show up even for myself, I had to allow myself to be avoidant, because it helps me show up better when I cannot be avoidant. And it takes a lot of energy to process what's going on within ourselves and our community. So I let that energy release through a source that feels right for me. And that this helps me show up better when I need to turn on for myself mentally and be there for others.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And if I could also ask, in your clients that you're dealing with as well, both allies and LGBTQ plus people, how are you kind of advising them on the day-to-day as well, what they can do?
Yeah. Part of my therapy work, and I feel like a lot of therapists kind of miss this a little bit, is bringing in the larger context of what's happening like in the legislation on a macro level. And so the first thing I did with all of my LGBTQ plus clients, even though I know they wanted a little avoidance in there, but just to check in, just to be like, hey, what's going on for you, with these events? How are you feeling? How can I hold space for you in here? What support do you need? What can I offer you? So, and I talk with a lot of my clients about the legislation that comes up, not just events like this, but also the larger attacks that are happening on that level. So yes, I show up, they show up, I hold that space for them. We talk about it, we tease through it. Yeah.
That's really powerful. Thank you. And the showing up, I think that is just talking about that, like being present is so powerful. Sandra, you're in the DEI space and you deal with so many different inclusion and diversity issues, but and that's difficult and heavy work. But how are you moving through when you see, the violence, the ongoing violence against LGBTQ plus people and others? What are the practices that you use in order to kind of move through either that grief or that trauma or anger or sadness, all of it?
Sometimes I cry. It's important to me. I will read and seek out all the news stories about victims, because I think it's really important to see them as human beings who are unique and special and loved. I think that as an individual, I owe them the dignity and respect about trying to think about each of them as a unique individual. I was struck by something that Marla said about people who need to avoid some of this, that they have to desensitize themselves as a protective mechanism, and I respect that. I feel, though, that for someone like me, it's important to affirmatively try to avoid that desensitization, because I think that the upset and the anger and the grief maybe help reinforce commitment to the work. It makes me think more affirmatively about what can I do as an individual? What can I do to help others who maybe haven't had to think about these things as much, how to help them be more effective and supportive as allies of whichever community happens to be targeted, and um, and to help people in other communities who might otherwise just brush this off as, well, it's not my community, so I don't really need to worry about this, to help them understand that this kind of senseless violence, this anger, this hate, it can easily impact any one of our different identities and the communities to which we belong and that we cherish. So I do think that it's almost like having to deliberately poke yourself or beat yourself to make sure that you don't just let it go. Although as I said, I respect those who think that it's important to separate themselves. And I think that at some point all of us need to, because otherwise you will be overwhelmed and even subsumed. But to the point that if we have the privilege of not having to grapple with it immediately because we're not in geographic proximity, or because it's a community that we support, but maybe we're not necessarily a part of, then we owe it to ourselves, if we're thinking, feeling human beings, to make that effort.
I think that's really powerful about confronting and when you can, to move in and really feel it and acknowledge the victims as full people, because I think you're exactly right. It's very easy to move past it and forget about the humanity and that human beings were murdered.
Well, also, I think that our legal training sometimes pushes us in that direction, because as lawyers, we tend to want to do something, fix things. And we generally take an approach that emphasizes more policies and laws and maybe programs. And that might satisfy our need to feel that we're taking action. But I'm unsure sometimes how helpful that really is. If there were policies or laws that could prevent tragedies like this from happening again, I would be all for them. But I feel like sometimes that alone is just inadequate. And as lawyers, I think it's hard for us to acknowledge that inadequacy. In addition to these sorts of efforts, I'd like to see us as a profession stop to have conversations like this one we're having right now, to think about what kinds of proactive steps could we as lawyers, as a profession, be taking. And I don't know the answers to it. But I think that not having the conversation or just thinking about it in terms of law and policy clearly hasn't worked.
No, I agree with you, and it hasn't. And I'm glad we're having this conversation, but it feels like this is just the start of other conversations. And what can we as a community and the bar do to help further those conversations about other interventions, other things that could actually have a different or impact as well. But kind of moving through that as well, Marla, you are an attorney that handles extremely complex transactions, working with enormous corporations. So what are you doing as an attorney to kind of move through the trauma of seeing something that happens like that, like at Club Q? Or how are you able to really balance, as Sandra said, your training as an attorney as a person, and also somebody who I know cares very deeply for your colleagues, for your clients, for the firm, for the community, all of that together, because it's a lot to balance. It's a lot to do your job while working through that. And is there anything that you're doing to help yourself?
So certainly there's some separation. I mean, if I am taking depositions or doing something that's, complex, that takes a lot of focus and mental energy, I think as with age, one of the things we learn to do is compartmentalize a bit and set some things aside, at least for the time being. And then though within the organization, it's supporting my colleagues. We had conversations around these issues among our LGBTQ firm members. And then, what I also find myself doing, and I didn't really realize it as such until kind of preparing for this panel and thinking about things, but I think I, without realizing it, kind of funnels some of the energy or frustration or trauma, whichever, word might be applicable, into raising kids who are open-minded and healthy. And we've got some age diversity on the panel, but I think all of us are fairly mature adults. And and when you get to a certain stage in life, the way you handle kind of the way you immediately handle these types of issues, it changes over time. And I'm at that point where I don't think my kids saw anything about this, because at least two of them are too young, at least from my point of view. But I do, my wife and I, we'd spend time raising kids who are comfortable in their own skin as children of lesbian parents, and who are also going to be, assuming they're not members of the LGBTQ community themselves, they are going to be allies. My daughter woke up on May 31st. She could not wait for Pride Month, because she has this shirt that she got from Target, and it says equality, and it's got a big rainbow going through it. And she woke up on May 31st and was like, is it June yet? Right? Because she is just ready to be out there as an ally. And her older 13-year-old brother is the same. And as her twin brother is more focused on him than anything else right now. But it is, I think raising kids and finding just avenues in our lives that are specific to where we are in our lives to remedy kind of the situation that exists right now is up to each of us.
I think that's really incredible. Really incredible. As a dad of two kids myself, I often feel like, if I can't help the situation now, what can I do with my kids and their school to make the situation better in the future? And making sure that they understand that they are, allies, and making sure that I'm a presence at their kids' school, so they can see, a family with two dads, and hopefully that will help in some way. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? That being joyful and being well and embracing joy and wellness as a member of a marginalized or embattled community is an act of sort of radical self-assertion, right? And to Sandra's point of a moment ago, this sense that, particularly as lawyers, that we're supposed to be doing something in response to horrible acts, embracing joy and wellness, which is a choice, right? It's not simply something that happens to a person. It is a choice. And that is a radical choice. And it is an act which not only is of central importance to our own well-being, but this is far from a new observation to me, but it gives other people permission and also a sense of hope and inspiration to prioritize their own joy and their own wellness. And it actually involves an extraordinarily difficult and persistent effort to treat your own joy and your own wellness as something that the world should expect when you're a member of an embattled or marginalized community. And I think one of the many sort of overdetermined sources of menace when an atrocity like Club Q is perpetrated is that it attempts to push us into a place where harm is what we expect, right? And insisting that joy and well-being is what we expect is an effort. And it is an effort that is not just sort of reactive and responsive, but is radical and affirmative and assertive. And so, holding family closer and then, brandishing the joy of a family to the world, that is an extraordinarily important affirmative act in response to a tragedy like this.
Tobias, I couldn't agree more. And I want to actually bring in Shannon, if it's okay to talk next. I feel like, Shannon, the work that you do and the work that your colleagues at NCLR and at ACLU and Lambda Legal, to be in that is to have to know that the future, it can be better, and to have joy in yourself, and to be able to, to have some kind of positive outlook, thinking that the world can be better, because the work that you do makes the world better, but it can be very difficult, very trying, but you have to have the belief that things can be better, I think, or I hope, or it'd be hard to do the work that you do. So could you talk a little bit about how you work through the grief of things like Club Q, but also in your career, you've had, legal highs and legal lows, right? About how things are going and how you continue to keep going and look forward to the future.
Yes, I don't know if there's a lot of joy in the work that we're doing right now. It feels so hard and so scary, to be honest with you. But I just like everything that people just said, that Sandra, Marla, and Tobias, all you just said. I'm just sitting here internally in my quiet lawyer way going, yeah. That's exactly, oh my gosh, so much so. I mean, I feel like, Sandra, I love everything you said. It's like, to me, the most important thing anybody could be doing, whatever context you're in, a law firm, wherever the heck you are, is yes, we need policies and laws and stuff, sure. But I mean, we just need to wrap LGBTQ people, and I will say trans people right now in particular, in network, relationship, community. I mean, people need to feel that they are embraced and connected, because I think one of the biggest dangers is people become, and I feel this tendency so strongly in myself, hypervigilant. And like Tobias, like you said, you just start thinking of yourself as nothing but reduced to this shell of a person defined exclusively by your vulnerability and this expectation of harm, and that, and you just want to isolate and hide and disengage. And we all know, I mean, well, Samantha, you probably know better than all of us as a mental health professional, but like that is the single worst thing that you can do. I mean, it's deadly in every way to people's health and well-being. And so I just find myself struggling to not do that, and to remember to, to be with family and friends. I mean, even my animals, I have a lot of animals, I love them, but, like I live in a very conservative, I moved back to Texas, where I was born, to a very small, very conservative community. And I feel scared here. I do. For the first time in my entire life, I've never felt scared here. That's part of why I moved back here, because everyone's so loving. But I do feel scared now. But I've like yesterday, I went to get my hair cut, and I went to this little town, but nearby, and the woman who cut my hair used to cut my grandmother's hair. I didn't know that before I went, but it was just such an amazing, wonderful connection to feel like, what, I am a full person. Like whoever said that, I'm a whole person. I have a family. I have a history. I belong here as much as anyone else does, just to try to hang on to that. And yes, the work with the other legal organizations, with Lambda, the ACLU, Transgender Law Center, Till Death, all HRC, Southern Poverty Law Center, we're all like gay. We're all like all out. If people don't know that, please hear it. We are all out. Every single group is stretched to the absolute max of all our attorney bandwidth, fighting, bringing challenges to these horrible laws. And it is really hard, and it is really draining. And it's honestly pretty scary. We're dealing with some scary stuff. We're losing experts because they're being harassed. Their families are being harassed. It's pretty rough out there, but I guess I'll just say again, please reach out, embrace people just as human beings. I mean, I think that's what we need now, more than anything. And we need to do that publicly too. Like that's the most important message for the public to hear right now. Is not, oh, we need a policy or a program, but hey, these are people in our communities. These are your families, your siblings, your parents, your children, your neighbors, your coworkers. I know that may sound trite, but it is not. That is the message that people need to hear.
Shannon, I really appreciate that so much. And I
think we lost your audio, Seth.
We did. Oh, we lost Seth. Oh yeah, Seth, we can't hear you.
I
There we
There
go.
you are.
Back.
Can you hear me now? Sorry
Yeah.
about that. I don't, 3 years into using Zoom 15 times a day, and it still does things that I don't understand. So I thank you. But Shannon, picking up on what you just said about community and reaching out to each other and making sure that we hold each other up and embrace each other, queer spaces are more important than ever, right? Spaces where we can go. And what I'm hearing, and I'm sure you've heard this as well, and this is a question for everyone, that sometimes people are afraid to go to queer spaces now, right? Especially after what happened in Club Q. So if you were talking to somebody who was feeling afraid to go, right, but needed that sense of community, could you talk to me about what your advice would be for them, and the importance in your own life about LGBTQ plus safe spaces?
I'll start in saying I have something a little bit less sort of, rosy and enthusiastic to say in response to that question, which is, I think that the relationship of queer and trans people with physical spaces where we gather and experience solidarity is very much in flux and in transition right now. And I think that has in part to do with the ascendance of app culture and the fact that in particular men who have sex with men, but not exclusively, are looking to sort of virtual connection as a way of finding each other rather than encountering each other in physical spaces. And that's had a huge impact on the relationship between hookup culture and dating culture and expectations about, how, on what terms men in particular are encountering each other. I think that, for the last almost 3 years, we have had the difficult, fraught, anxiety-producing circumstance of the pandemic. People have taken very, very different approaches to that. And for people who continue to have the management of risk actively on their minds, I think that gathering together is an act of trust and an act of kind of, necessary intimacy in ways that it wasn't before the pandemic. And that just changes the kind of emotional landscape of every physical gathering, that, there's more at stake when people gather together, at least for a lot of people who continue to manage risk around the pandemic. And so I don't have, I think that gathering together is incredibly important. I think physical solidarity is indispensable. And I think I don't have, if you will, one size fits all advice for how to approach gathering in general and in particular during times of difficulty and trauma, except to say, recognize all of the ways in which the act of gathering together in person is different today from what it was 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And take seriously and honor those differences and figure out how you're situated in relation to that. And if it is a big deal for you to gather together, then gather together with other people for whom it is also a big deal. Because I think the thing which would be the most difficult is for you to be seeking physical community with people on terms that turn out to be very different from the people that you're seeking that community with. And it means more to you, or it means different things to you than it does to them. And that can just produce hurt feelings and misunderstanding and a lack, an unsuccessful gathering together. Be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional about what's on the table when it comes to physically gathering and whom you're gathering with. With that said, I think queer and trans affirming spaces are incredibly important right now. And I hope that one of the things that we will begin finding with each other with increasing frequency during this particular moment is the value and the mutual regard that is involved in physically gathering together. And I think, as I'm sorry, I'm going on a little bit, but as one last observation, one thing that can happen in response to trauma is, I think, a kind of catastrophizing mindset where we can massively overestimate the nature of risk, and without minimizing the reality of physical risk and threat in that's being directed at queer and trans communities. I think it is also important to be clear that it is not, when a hideous atrocity like this one gets perpetrated, it doesn't mean that that's likely to happen to you if you gather together in queer and trans spaces. You need to be aware, and you need to know how to recognize risk and threat, but not to fall down the rabbit hole of overestimating the nature of that risk at the cost of your own ability to gather together physically.
Tobias, I think that's perfectly said. And we all have been through so much trauma over the last 3+ years, 6 years, really, when you're counting the Trump administration and COVID. And it feels that there are times when it's easy to become catastrophizing because we've been through so much. So, Samantha, following up on that, when you have clients that you're working with who are worried about going to queer spaces, but are looking for community, and Tobias is also right, really setting expectations from the people that you're with in person, what you're looking for, what they're looking for. What is the advice that you give to your clients when you're working with them? And also, if you could speak a little bit in your mind, what is the importance of having queer spaces for somebody during these really traumatic times?
Yeah. Well, I'll first start with, I loved hearing kind of everyone's trauma responses and thoughts on trauma responses, because I think it shows the vast array of that, how you show up to trauma, how you react to trauma. It's so valid, and it's going to be so different. Everyone's going to have different reactions. So we heard, I talked a little bit about that avoidance piece, and there's also that like fight piece. Like, I want to go out there. I want to, I want to do something. I want to be a part of something. Both are valid. Right. And my big thing is, I always have people come back to their body. Like, what are you feeling in your body when you think about going to that place? When you think about going to that bar right now, what's going on in your body? Are you getting tight? Are you getting anxious? Is it getting hot? Are you getting excited? Right? Because some people, we think we want to go do something, and then we have to come back to our body, and we're like, oh, our body's actually telling us it's trying to protect yourself. And maybe it's trying to tell you be avoidant, or maybe it's trying to tell you, go out, you're okay. I got you. You're feeling okay. Right. So I always have people come back to what their inner dialogue is, how their body's reacting to thinking about doing something. Again, you don't have to do anything you don't feel safe with. Maybe that means talking to your friends or partners about boundaries you may have with boundaries you're having with going out right now. If going out doesn't feel safe, allow that. With time, you may work with some exposure and response and slowly get back into the community when you're ready to. Also, it's great if you want to go out there. I just say both responses are valid. That's totally natural trauma responses, right? So I just want to highlight, because I was hearing differing responses, and they're all valid, right? In terms of queer spaces, I think it's the importance of it is that it's a space with intentionality, right? It's focused on its community and members being seen, respected, validated, and bringing a sense of community and commonality with other members. So it's having, that specific support system that functions with the intention of protecting these specific identities. I know I love my dedicated spaces. They bring me comfort. You feel part of something. All your people are there. So truly, it's all you could want in a space, but sometimes we're not ready to enter that after something like this, and that's okay.
I think that's great advice, making sure you listen to your body and making sure you're doing what's comfortable and when you're ready for it. So thank you so much, Samantha. We're actually close to the end of our hour. And I'd like to ask a final question to Marla, if that's okay. And Marla, you are somebody who is in a position of leadership at a large firm, and has the responsibility of both leading an office and heading a DEI initiative. And there are other people who are watching us today who I think are probably also in leadership at firms or have unofficial leadership positions. And if you are advising them on what to do in their workplace when confronted with really, LGBTQ plus violence, things that we saw at Club Q, things we saw at Pulse, is there anything that you would advise them to do in order to make their workplaces, better for all employees, both allies and queer people?
Sure. And I think it's advice that would apply more broadly, not just to the LGBTQ community, but we did some of this in summer of 2020 in the wake of George Floyd and that aftermath. And that is to be very deliberate about two things. One is creating communities that are a community and a safe space for people in the LGBTQ community. In summer of 2020, we got our Black lawyers and staff together just to talk about what they were feeling, like literally just to talk about what they were feeling and to create that support for each other. So one would be to create that deliberate community for people to have a safe space to talk through what they're feeling, especially in, we're not completely out of COVID and people are still feeling isolated. And so sometimes that might be the only opportunity they have to have that safe space and share. And then the other component is to be very deliberate about educating those who are not members of the particular community about what that particular community is feeling and experiencing. I think that can help in a work context. It can help if you see somebody's productivity start to drop down. Maybe you sat in on a lunch talk about how people respond to trauma in the wake of incidents like these. And now maybe it makes sense, right? And just creating opportunities for people to be allies because they understand what particular communities are experiencing. So I think those two things, kind of creating the community for the particular group and then educating the rest of the community so that they can be better allies and supporters.
That's great advice, Marla. Thank you so much. And I think that's a great place for us to end today. This is just the beginning of a conversation. We have so much more to talk about, but I really want to thank our panel, Sandra, Marla, Samantha, Tobias, and Shannon. Thank you so much. And another plug, if your mental health is suffering, please reach out to resources in your community. Lifeline, Trans Lifeline, Trevor, there are many resources. Shannon, I think you have your hand up. Was there something you wanted to say?
I just want to say one last thing, which is I think the most radical healing thing any of us can do right now is create community. I just wanted to thank the LGBT Bar Association for doing that for so long, so intentionally, and doing it and having this panel too. Just really appreciate you all very much.
Thank you, Shannon. We really appreciate that. And again, thank you to our panelists. I want to say our Chief Program Officer, Judy O'Kelly, and our other portion of our program team, Patrick O'Brien, are amazing. Thank you for putting this together. And I also would love to see everyone in creating community at Lavender Law at the end of July this year in Chicago. It is a place that we can come together as both individuals and attorneys and explore not only the legal issues that are so important to us right now, but just create those personal connections that help us through times that are difficult and trying. The people I've met at Lavender Law have been mentors and important to me. And I hope that you can also have that same experience. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day. And as Tobias said, let's have some joy. It's a radical act. So I hope you do something joyful today. And we will talk and see you soon. Thank you.